Chapter 19. Soledor. The ship slipped into Soledor harbor, the water reflecting the morning sky stippled with clouds that caught the golden color of the rising sun. The shore was enclosed by steep bluffs, which crowded ramshackle sheds, shops, and homes that made up the unrecognized settlement that had become the base of the resistance. Or so Val had said. Now, as the men in the towboat strained against the oars to draw the rest bar to dock, Haille watched from behind the bow, Chloe beside him. He listened as a set of footsteps approached them. Haille turned to see Val holding a sheathed sword. Haille knew the sword well, the top of the handle fashioned into the profile of an elk, the antlers branching through the crossguard and holding a heart between them. Haille stared at Elkhart, the sword crafted for him by Pathus Sunderland himself. It was like a relic from another life, and Haille at first hesitated to take it back.
"It's yours, Prince Haille. You wielded it well, and it's about time you did so again."
Haille could feel Chloe's eyes watching him. He sensed that the trainings, the beatings, the discussions had all led to this. It was more than taking back a sword, but rather an identity.
"I don't know if I'm worthy, ready even,"
Haille said, his hand stopping short of the handle. "Truth is, we never are," Chloe said in a warm, soft voice beside him. "Take it, Haille. It's yours." Haille clasped the handle, pleased at how familiar it felt, how light and balanced the blade was compared to the clumsy practice swords that he had been using. His mentors had little else to say. The moment of testing passed. This was the beginning of further tests, where failing meant death for himself and others. As he buckled the sword and sheath to his belt, he felt a weight more than physical on his shoulders. But, like Val had said long ago in the house of Sandal and Blythewood, where they had stayed with the elves of Sidon, Haille knew it was time to at least put forward a face of courage. It's only when you are afraid that you truly know if you can be brave. Val's words from that night echoed in his mind. Haille turned to the captain, weighing so many of his lessons in his mind. Val, for his part, stood at the foremost point of the bow, his lips set in a fine, pensive line. Haille did not need to ask what troubled him. With a look to the shore, he could see it for himself. The docks were empty of movement. The ships moored there were few, and the sky above the town was clear. Not a fire was burning in a single hearth. No smoke, not even gulls hovered in the air over the town. Then Haille saw a single skiff, bobbing in the water, sending out tiny spreading circles of waves. All eyes were on the skiff as its lone passenger pulled up the oars as he neared the towing boat and glided past to come alongside the rest bar. "Well, if it isn't the devil himself," Chloe said from behind Val, who leaned over the rail, relief turning the creases in his face to smile lines.
"Cody, you are a welcome emissary. Welcome indeed,"
Val said.
"Captain Manderley,"
Cody said, saluting as the skiff neared. Val's expression turned quizzical.
"Why the formality, old friend? What news? Soledor looks like a ghost town."
"The militia has decamped for higher ground, just over the bluffs, but a few longshoremen remain ready to meet you. Steer for the southernmost pier. I'll meet you there." Val shouted toward the towboat.
"You are the man. Pull to starboard."
The men altered their course, while Val turned to Gunther.
"See if you can spell a zephyr into the sails to help them."
Gunther nodded, walking back to the stern, Gregor alongside him. With a few enchantments, they called forth a gentle breeze that aided the men straining at the oars of the towboat. Still, the rest bar was heavy, laden with many passengers, and waterlogged from sailing through the rain. Cody reached the pier long before them, and Haille watched as their old friend tied up his own boat and walked the length of the pier to the shore, where he sat alone, waiting on a barrel next to a leaning structure with boarded windows and a patched roof. It was the largest structure Haille could see in the town of small buildings, and he guessed it would make a good place to shelter the many escaped slaves they carried with them.
I long to hear that old dog's adventures since we left him in Kerith to head north,
Val said to Chloe. Yes, she said, picking a blister on her palm, then biting some of the dead skin away. Funny though, when was the last time you knew him to call you by your surname? Val shrugged.
Never.
Neither seemed to think much more of the incongruity. Val moving to the gangway, Chloe following, spitting out the piece of skin she had freed from her palm. Haille was close behind, and descending the gangway onto the planks of the dock. Sailors secured the lines, while the men they had freed worked their way off the ship, carrying the wounded and the weak. The dock was soon crowded, and Val turned from supervising the movement of men and supplies to ask Haille to fetch Cody, who was still seated at the end of the dock, whittling a stick with a dagger.
Go see what is keeping him. Ask if we can move the men to that warehouse.
Haille nodded and worked his way through the throng of men to walk the length of the pier to where Cody waited, a harbor bell hanging on the post behind him. Cody continued to whittle his stick into a sharp point. Azure accompanied Haille, floating from one pylon to the next, her chirps loud in the quiet morning. The water below the planks at Haille's feet was black and covered with an oily sheen. The bluffs rose overhead, appearing higher now that he was on shore, their tops blocking the palette of colors presented by the morning sky. It was a peaceful morning. So why wasn't Haille feeling more settled? He shivered as he walked from sun into shadow. The lanes leading to the shore were still empty. Not even a cat wandered past looking for fish scraps. He was wondering where the longshoremen were that Cody had spoken of when he thought he saw something move beyond the gap in the door to the warehouse.
Prince Haille, we meet again,
Cody said. He had slid the dagger into its sheath and did not look up as he cleaned his nails with the tip of the stick. Cody, Val wants to know where we can lead the men. Some are wounded from battle, he said, watching Azure land near the door to the warehouse. Can we take them into that warehouse there? Cody's eye twitched, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile.
Why don't you go see?
Haille hesitated. Something did not feel right, with Cody, the town, the morning all together. Where were the people, the animals, the birds? Why was the place preternaturally silent? His nose twitched at a foul odor. It was sour, dark, something different than the smell of dung, fish offal, and tarred timbers that characterized most port towns. The planks of the dock were shaking as Val and the others made their way closer. Cody's eyes flashed up at them, and his jaw flexed. Haille noticed Azure hopping closer to the gap in the warehouse door, her head twitching as she peered inside. He stepped closer to the shore. As he did, something just below the surface of the water caught his eye. It was a face. At first he thought it was his own reflected, but he realized it was not, nor was it alone. At that moment, Azure let out a panicked warble, her wings snapping as she made straight for Haille. He turned to run. "It's a trap!" he cried out to the others. But Cody was already up, his hand clasped around the harbor bell's clapper. The bell sounded, and the sailors and passengers of the rest bar became still, just as the doors to the warehouse groaned open, and a nightmare issued forth. Vorgs. The noise of their cries was like a herd of boars, their mismatched armor jangling as they rushed out, the whole warehouse filled to its back walls with their gray and green bodies. The flood of horror parted and coursed around Cody, whose own face had turned into a demonic mask, his eyes burning with hate for his former friends.
To arms! Val called out, but no sooner had he cried out than the Vorgs were upon them, flashing blades and wielding cudgels. Haille drew Elkhart and joined in the fight, but the ground was not advantageous. The Vorgs, greater in number, poured down the length of the pier, pushing many of the surprised men into the water, where Haille now saw the sunken bodies of hundreds of dead militia soldiers. Their break came as Gregor and Gunther rushed to the fore, and together called upon a wave that sucked up the water from the shore, exposing rocks and the tangled bodies of dead men, built into a mountain of water and swept across the pier, sending the first line of Vorgs spilling into the harbor. Haille hacked and stabbed his way forward, grateful now for the practice Val and Chloe had insisted upon, both of them close, on his left and right. The bell had stopped ringing, Cody gone from its side. Haille searched the chaos for him, and did not have to look far. Their friend was descending upon them, his sword drawn, his stare fixed on Haille himself. 2 men from the rest bar engaged Cody, and he made quick work slaying them. His fighting form advanced from what Haille knew of their friend. Val and Chloe readied themselves, their swords drawn, but their faces still confused. Cody! What is the meaning of this?
Val cried. Cody's answer was steel. He met blades with Val and turned to catch Chloe as she flanked him. She twisted in close, drawing a knife with her free hand, but Cody raised his own empty palm, flexed his fingers, and sent Chloe flying off the dock and over the water to the shore, where she crashed into a stack of crates, which shattered into splinters from the impact. Haille's skull tingled, as he had learned it would in the presence of powerful magic. Cody closed in on the flabbergasted Val, but stopped when a horn sounded from the bluffs above. The bluffs presented a steep wall of earth along the length of the town, but the north and south slopes were gentle enough to ride down on horseback, and riders were coming, letting out a war cry, flying the banner of Anthor at the fore. Leading the charge was an elk with a shining crown of silver.
It's Adamantus, Haille said.
The Vorgs abandoned their attack on the ship and began to regroup in the space before the warehouse, shoring up their flanks by closing together shields and throwing up barricades of barrels and crates. It was of little use. The riders came down like an avalanche, crashing into the hastily built shield wall and trampled Vorgs before them. Howls, screeches, whinnies, and yells rose up to the heavens as horses, men, and monsters collided. Adamantus showed no mercy as he slashed and impaled one Vorg after another with his antlers. To Haille's greater confusion, he saw another Cody, this one on horseback with a Corinthian ranger to his left, and a rider who Haille thought to be Avenger Red on Cody's right. "Haille!" a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Caitlin riding up to him, a compact girl in Morvant war paint and bare arms riding beside her, letting fly one arrow after another into the Vorgs with deadly efficiency. "Caitlin, is it really you?" "Of course it is." "Then who is that?" he said, pointing to the first Cody, who on foot was still slaying men, his sword red and bloody. A rider tried to trample him, but Cody struck in close, stabbed the man in his thigh, unhorsed him, and mounted himself in the saddle. As he did so, the second Cody spied him, surprise on his face. The first Cody organized the Vorgs, and they formed into ranks for a counterattack, riders having broken through their ranks, but the Vorgs had superior numbers. "We are still outnumbered," Haille said. "Not for long," Caitlin said as another horn blasted a high, pure note that sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds. It felt like power and hope, like the inexorable coming of spring after a long winter. Haille's heart skipped a beat. "There!" Caitlin pointed to the southern shore. Pounding through surf and sand on a wave of ponies, their manes flying, were riders in resplendent armor that caught the slanting morning sun. Their faces and blades seemed to glow with their own light, and the water formed a sparkling aura around them.
The elves have come!" No sooner had Caitlin spoken did Haille pick out the figures leading the charge. Caliph, Lazalorn, and between them, her hair flying like a war banner, her sword lowered for immediate attack, rode Violin. A howl of terror rose from the Vorg horde, and they began to scatter, but it was too late. The elves were upon them with fire, bolts, and blades. Many of the men from the ship, never having seen such a spectacle, cowered, but the men led by the second Cody pressed on from the north, and soon the Vorgs were overrun. A chorus of chirping followed as the Jays, all three of them, Sapphire, Cyan, and Azure, reunited about Haille's shoulders. Baby Jays, just in the nick of time. Adamantus barreled through a group of Vorgs, then came alongside Haille and stopped to regard the unfolding battle. The elk locked eyes with the first Cody. This Cody snarled, reared his horse, and began to gallop in the opposite direction.
"It's the Magus,"
Adamantus exclaimed. "Come on," Caitlin said, pulling Haille up beside her on the saddle with the confidence of an experienced rider. So much had changed since they had first fled Antis City, when she had struggled to remain in a saddle. All was movement, wild swords swinging and clanging collisions of blades, armor, and claws as they pressed through the mob. Caitlin spurred her horse on at a reckless speed. The Morvant girl fended off attacks for them until they were free of the battle completely and followed the chase. Adamantus pursued, down empty lanes, past storefronts and porches, trading houses and taverns. The imposter Cody pushed his horse forward even as it stumbled, its strength flagging. Adamantus closed the distance, and Cody turned down a lane between two buildings. The elk disappeared around the corner, not breaking off his pursuit. Caitlin kicked her own horse to follow faster, the Morvant girl covering their backs. The lane opened up to a square that backed up to the bluffs themselves. It must have been a place for trading slaves, for a block with chains was set in the center. The imposter Cody rode up to the block and circled it. Nowhere left to go. Caitlin pulled up on the reins, her horse coming to a stop, the Morvant girl next to them. "Talia, stay close," Caitlin said. The girl called Talia knocked back an arrow and took aim at the imposter Cody while Adamantus approached. "Stygorn," Cody said. "What is old is new, and new is old. Our meeting was inevitable, was it not?" Adamantus raked the ground with a hoof.
"Reveal yourself. The time for masks and illusions is over."
"Is it?" Cody said, swinging his sword. "Illusion has served me well. We know our roles. We were enemies long before the whelps behind you were ever born, long before these kingdoms were founded. We remember the empires whose ashes they rose from."
"Some empires should remain in the past.
And some creatures outlive their time,
as do some servants their masters."
Adamantus had heard enough and charged. Cody, or the Magus disguised as him, rode out to meet him. Adamantus would show no mercy, swinging his antlers low and slashing open the neck of the horse. The animal fell to its knees and onto its belly with a bellow, its life blood pouring out in a red gush. The Magus pitched forward onto the ground and tumbled over before coming to his feet and drawing a short sword from his belt. Dirt mixed with blood on his forehead, and his teeth showed, white as his mad, wild eyes. They clashed again, antlers against steel, but unlike the Vorgs or other adversaries Haille had seen challenge Adamantus, the Magus knew how to meet the elk's attacks, catching his blows and counterattacking, so that the elk had to step sideways and backwards, his hooves scraping and stabbing the ground for balance, fans of dirt spinning up into the air about them both. The Magus, still in Cody's likeness, spun forward in an attack that slipped past Adamantus' defenses and scoured a gash on his head between his eyes. Cody's comely face smiled, the blood dripping from his sword. Adamantus circled once before driving in again with an attack that left the Magus on his back. Adamantus brought his hooves down, but the Magus kicked up his legs, landed upright, and sidestepped just as the elk landed. Talia's bowstring twanged and sent an arrow spinning at the Magus' back. But, with a glance and a narrowing of his eyes, he cast the arrow into flames, so that only soot and embers remained in a cloud. Adamantus swung down his rack of antlers in a straight-on attack, this time driving the Magus backwards, his feet sliding in the dirt. As he began to lose his footing, he bent his knees, rolled to the ground, somersaulted, and landed running. He placed the trading block between them. As they circled, Haille noticed a new gash on Adamantus' shoulder.
"You've overplayed your hand, elk,"
the Magus said, his face misshapen, the illusion protecting his identity slipping.
"We'll see,"
Adamantus said, but Haille noticed one of the elk's legs buckle as he paced around the block. The Magus' form shimmered again, and out of his torso grew 2 more arms, each with swords identical to his first 2. He spun them like interlocking windmills. Haille knew it to be an illusion, but it was a confusing one. Which blades were real? Which blades would Adamantus block? The Magus charged, leaping from the block. Adamantus reversed his steps and held his ground, swinging, dipping, stabbing at the blades, the antlers sounding each time they struck true. Haille could not tell real from fake, nor could Talia or Caitlin, for they gasped many times together when they thought one of the real blades had slipped past Adamantus' crown, only to pass through his head or body, as ephemeral as a shadow. "I can't watch," Caitlin said.
"It will be over soon,"
Haille said, sure that the elk now held the upper hand, as he continued to guess correctly which limbs and blades were real and which were fake. The elk could control the pace of the fighting now, driving the Magus backwards. Haille only grew afraid when the Magus lost ground and moved towards the 3 of them as they watched. Haille thought to move farther back, out of range, but he was too late. The Magus, sensing an opening, turned and flung his swords end over end towards them. "Watch out," Haille said, diving from the saddle and pulling Caitlin and Talia down with him.
"No,"
Adamantus said, stepping in the path of the flying blades. But they faded and evaporated along with the phantom limbs, only a feint. Adamantus staggered suddenly, having guessed wrong this one time. The elk shook and coughed up blood as the Magus' real sword buried hilt deep in his chest. With a final flourish, the Magus dragged the short sword across Adamantus' neck. His eyes rolling back to the sky, Adamantus fell. The misshapen face that only faintly resembled Cody now shimmered in a devious smile of triumph. He kicked his sword free as Adamantus rolled to his side, his antlers sending up sprays of dirt, his hooves gouging at the earth. "Adamantus!" Haille heard himself cry. He drew Elkhart and scrambled to his feet. The Magus, whoever he was, smiled, welcoming Haille's foolhardy attack. But his expression changed when the elven horn sounded once more, and Violin, her brothers, Val, and Chloe rounded the corner of the square. The Magus threw his blades aside, abandoning them. His body shrank and twisted into a raven, and rose into the air, flying high over the houses, the bluffs, and disappearing into the sky. Haille knelt beside Adamantus, the elk on his side, his head twisted, his mouth open. Caitlin and Talia were trying to stop the bleeding, but it was of little use. Haille tore off his cloak and pressed it to the wounds, but blood, hot as bath water, covered his hands. "No, no, no!" In his distress, Haille did not even realize the elk was calling his name. It was Talia who tugged his sleeve for his attention. "No, I need to hold this, to the wound," Haille said.
"It is too late for that, Haille,"
he heard the elk whisper. He moved to the elk's face, dimly aware of the others gathered around him. He was focused on the elk's eyes,
which held Haille in a powerful grasp. Haille grew still, his panicked breathing steadying, his pulse slowing. It was as if time were slowing down. It reminded him of the first night he had seen the elk in the cage, when those eyes, like twin moons, held such beauty, possibilities, and potential. Just like that night, the elk's gaze penetrated into him so that he felt it was only he and the elk, together, waiting in the moment of judgment and surrender.
Haille, you have to carry it.
Carry what?
What I will give you. Your suffering. It has made you worthy.
I don't understand. The elk's eyes closed for a moment, then reopened, wide. Haille's body became rigid, his mind filled with light and visions he could not understand, emotions, knowledge of lifetimes that were not his own, vistas of cities in the clouds that he knew his own eyes had never seen. There were cycles of gains and losses, victory and defeats, light and dark. He fell into a cavern of eternity, where love, fear, pain, joy, ecstasy, and suffering were all the same. It was too much and would overwhelm him. He'd never be worthy. He'd be a vessel that would crack. He tried to free himself of the transference, but the spell would decide when he was free, when he would belong to himself again. His consciousness stretched to infinity. His self disappeared. Then he snapped back, a universe compressed into a grain of sand. He fell backwards in agony. For a moment, he saw Violin's face as he had seen her in the forest next to the Gillithwain before he had fallen asleep. And that was all he could now. Close his eyes to sleep, to dream, to live 1,000 lives, and die 1,000 deaths.